"I don't know why I drank. I just knew I couldn't stop," said George Jones, the legendary country crooner whose voice could break hearts and whose addiction broke nearly everything else. In the world of country music, pain has always been a melody. Heartbreak, loneliness, betrayal, regret. These themes echo through steel guitars and whiskey-soaked ballads. But for some artists, the line between performance and real pain blurred dangerously. Today, we open the curtain on the 20 country music icons who were drunk all the time, what they lost, what they ruined, and, in a few rare cases, how they found their way back. George Jones. George Jones is often hailed as one of the greatest voices in the history of country music. Known for his heartbreaking delivery and emotional depth, Jones recorded timeless hits like "He Stopped Loving Her Today" and "The Grand Tour." His influence on generations of artists is undeniable, and his voice is considered one of the most expressive in the genre. But behind the accolades and platinum records was a man battling a relentless addiction, one that nearly destroyed his legacy. As his fame grew in the 1960s and 70s, so did George Jones's dependence on alcohol. It wasn't casual drinking, it was all-consuming. His binges were legendary, often lasting for days, and he would vanish before shows or interviews, leaving his team in panic. The industry gave him the nickname No-Show Jones for his chronic absences at concerts, a problem that alienated fans and infuriated promoters. One of the most infamous incidents came when his then-wife, fed up with his drinking, hid the car keys to prevent him from driving to a liquor store. Determined and intoxicated, Jones rode a lawnmower for miles down a Texas highway in search of alcohol. The image of a country legend on a lawnmower, disheveled and desperate, became symbolic of how far he had fallen. Jones's career took a severe hit. He was sued multiple times for missed shows, lost millions in canceled tours, and his reputation sank. His relationships suffered, especially with fellow artist Tammy Wynette, whom he married in 1969. Their love story, once the subject of duets and tabloid fascination, devolved into a public tale of volatility, alcoholism, and domestic chaos. Jones was also prone to violent mood swings while drunk. Stories of hotel room destruction, public meltdowns, and bar fights followed him. At one point, his behavior was so erratic that he was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. The industry that once praised him began to distance itself, unsure of what version of George they'd get on any given day. The singer or the storm? Miraculously, George Jones turned his life around in the 1990s. After decades of abuse, he quit drinking with the support of his fourth wife, Nancy Sepulvado, and began a slow but steady path to redemption. He returned to the stage, sober, and delivered some of the best performances of his later life. When he died in 2013, it was not as a cautionary tale, but as a survivor, a man who had faced the abyss and climbed back out. Even today, George Jones remains a symbol of both what country music can offer and what it can cost. Rất tốt. Tôi sẽ tiếp tục với nhân vật thứ hai, Hank Williams Sr. Và lần này sẽ loại bỏ tiêu đề từng mục như bạn yêu cầu, giữ nguyên cấu trúc kể chuyện mạch lạc, sắc sảo theo prompt C001. Hank Williams Sr. was more than just a pioneer of country music. He was a prophet of pain. His songs, raw and drenched in loneliness, tapped into emotions most artists couldn't reach. "I'm so lonesome I could cry" wasn't just a lyric. It was a warning from a man spiraling into darkness. By his late 20s, Hank wasn't just battling alcohol. He was drowning in it. His success came fast, too fast. By 1949, Hank was a household name. But fame couldn't mend his broken back, his volatile marriage, or the ache inside him. The bottle became his constant companion, and he began showing up to shows drunk, incoherent, or not at all. His charm would disappear, replaced by slurred words and a staggering frame. The Grand Ole Opry, the crown jewel of country music, eventually fired him for his unreliability. No one had ever been kicked out like that, especially not Hank Williams. The more he drank, the more he hurt the people around him. His wife Audrey left him. His band couldn't trust him. Promoters blacklisted him. But still, the public adored him, playing his records while he burned quietly behind the curtain. He began popping painkillers on top of whiskey, chasing a numbness that never came. On New Year's Day, 1953, a driver found him dead in the backseat of his Cadillac. He was only 29 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but everyone knew what really killed him. Hank Williams died drunk, alone, and full of regret. Yet even now, more than 70 years later, his voice echoes. He was the first country superstar consumed by alcohol, and far from the last. Keith Whitley didn't just sing about heartbreak. He embodied it. With a voice that could pierce silence and lyrics that felt like confessions, Whitley was set to become one of country music's brightest stars. But behind every note was a man losing his fight with the bottle, one drink at a time. Born in Kentucky and raised on bluegrass, Whitley's talent was undeniable from a young age. By the time he joined J.D. Crowe in the New South, he was already known in music circles as a prodigy. But so was his reputation for hard drinking. Friends joked that he could outdrink anyone. No one was laughing later. When Whitley launched his solo career in the mid-1980s, his star soared fast. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All weren't just hits, they were emotional wrecking balls. But offstage, he was spiraling. He'd show up at recording sessions drunk. His team tried hiding his car keys, watering down his liquor, even begging him to go to rehab. Nothing worked. His wife, fellow country singer Lori Morgan, later said she lived in fear every time she left the house, afraid she'd come home to find him gone. That fear became reality on May 9, 1989. Keith Whitley was found dead in their Nashville home. He was just 34 years old. The cause, acute alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol level was more than 5 times the legal limit. Whitley's death sent shockwaves through the industry. He had just begun scratching the surface of his potential. In the years since, his music has become legend, but so has the haunting truth. He didn't die in a fiery crash or a scandalous tabloid story. He died in bed, quietly, with a bottle nearby. In the end, it wasn't fame or fortune that took Keith Whitley. It was a lifelong battle with alcohol. One that he lost far too soon. Johnny Paycheck lived the outlaw life long before it became a brand. His gravel voice and rebellious songs made him a favorite among fans of hardcore country. But behind the music was a man driven by impulse, rage, and a constant flood of alcohol. Before he was famous, Paycheck had already earned a reputation for trouble. He enlisted in the Navy, only to end up court-martialed after attacking a superior officer. He spent 2 years in military prison, and that was just the beginning. By the time his hit, Take This Job and Shove It, made him a household name in 1977, Paycheck had already lived through bar fights, public meltdowns, and a string of run-ins with the law, nearly all fueled by alcohol. He drank like a man possessed. It wasn't just part of his image. It was his identity. Friends said he'd show up to recording sessions already half gone, or disappear for days on whiskey-fueled benders. And when he drank, he got mean, violent, dangerous. In 1985, his drinking reached a terrifying climax. During a heated argument in a bar in Hillsboro, Ohio, Paycheck pulled out a .22 pistol and shot a man in the head. The man survived, but Paycheck was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He served 22 months before receiving a pardon, but the damage was done. His career had flatlined. Paycheck's later years were a fog of alcohol, financial ruin, and regret. He declared bankruptcy, lost his house, and struggled with health problems made worse by decades of drinking. He died in 2003 at age 64, a legend tarnished, a voice silenced, but a cautionary tale engraved in country music's darker chapters. Johnny Paycheck didn't just sing outlaw country, he lived it. And in the end, it destroyed him. Waylon Jennings was the face of outlaw country, a renegade who defied Nashville's polished rules and carved a place for the rough-edged, truth-telling artist. His deep baritone voice and gritty lyrics captured the spirit of rebellion. But the same defiance that made him a star also fueled his decades-long war with addiction, particularly to alcohol and amphetamines. In the early years, Jennings was just another struggling artist in Texas. But things changed when he became friends with Buddy Holly. He even gave up his seat on the ill-fated plane crash that killed Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper. The guilt of surviving that crash haunted Waylon for the rest of his life, and, many say, pushed him deeper into alcohol and drug abuse. By the time he and Willie Nelson were topping charts with Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, Jennings was drinking heavily and using cocaine daily. But unlike others, he functioned under pressure. He delivered hits, filled stadiums, and recorded legendary albums like Honky Tonk Heroes and Dreaming My Dreams. On the surface, he was thriving. Inside, he was collapsing. His drinking intensified as the years rolled on. Jennings once described his daily cocktail of pills, whiskey, and cocaine as maintenance. He claimed he couldn't record without it. Behind the scenes, friends worried. He was unpredictable. Sometimes charming and brilliant, other times aggressive and aloof. He'd disappear for days or isolate himself in hotel rooms filled with smoke and bottles. In 1984, his body finally gave out. Doctors warned him of imminent death unless he changed. He quit cocaine, then gradually let go of alcohol, one of the few in his circle who made it out alive. Jennings eventually became an advocate for recovery and honesty in the industry, speaking openly about the toll his addictions had taken. When he died in 2002, at the age of 64, Jennings was sober. But the scars remained, physical and emotional. His music never stopped being real, and neither did the pain it was born from. Merle Haggard's life was the blueprint for a country song, born poor, jailed young, saved by music, and haunted by demons. His outlaw image was no act. Before he became the poet of the working man, Haggard was behind bars, addicted to alcohol, and on a fast path to self-destruction. Raised in a converted boxcar in California during the Great Depression, Haggard's early years were marked by loss and rebellion. His father died when Merle was 9, and by his teens, he was running away, stealing cars, and drinking hard. By the time he was 20, he'd landed in San Quentin prison, serving time for attempted robbery. It was in prison that Haggard saw Johnny Cash perform, a moment he later said changed his life. But even after his release and meteoric rise in country music, the habits of self-medication lingered. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Haggard was often drunk, both on stage and off. Bandmates recounted nights where he'd perform brilliantly, then collapse backstage, incoherent, eyes glassy. His most famous hit, Okie from Muskogee, positioned him as a voice for conservative America. But behind the curtain, he was drinking heavily and using marijuana and cocaine. Fans never saw the contradictions, the tough-talking Merle who couldn't put down the bottle. Alcohol cost him relationships and business deals. He was married 5 times, and many of those breakups were fueled by drinking, jealousy, and violence. He'd storm out of recording sessions, fire band members in a rage, then apologize with a bottle in hand. Later in life, Haggard became more reflective. In interviews, he spoke with regret about how alcohol had stolen years of his life. He eventually got sober, crediting the love of his family and the realization that he was burning everything he'd worked for. He made a musical comeback, touring into his 70s and collaborating with younger artists. When he passed away in 2016, on his 79th birthday, Merle Haggard was no longer just a country legend. He was a survivor. But those who knew him best would say he could have lived fuller, longer, if not for the bottle that chased him his whole life. Tammy Wynette was known as the First Lady of country music, a voice of strength and sorrow who sang about standing by your man, even when that man or the world was falling apart. But behind the image of poise and elegance was a woman fighting chronic pain, emotional trauma, and a deep dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs. Her life was never easy. Born Virginia Wynette Poog in rural Mississippi, she worked as a beautician before rising to stardom with songs like Stand By Your Man, Divorce, and Till I Can Make It on My Own. Audiences connected with her emotional vulnerability, but few realized how much of it came from real suffering. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Tammy endured a series of health issues, including severe abdominal pain from multiple surgeries. Doctors prescribed painkillers, and she washed them down with alcohol. The combination was devastating. She became heavily dependent on both. Though she often denied having a drug or alcohol problem, those closest to her knew the truth. On tour, she would sometimes collapse backstage or struggle to remember lyrics. Her speech slurred, her eyes clouded. Her marriage to fellow country legend George Jones was a storm of passion and chaos, made worse by their mutual addictions. Their fights were public and explosive, often fueled by alcohol. After their divorce, Tammy attempted to keep up appearances, but her dependence grew worse. She reportedly underwent 26 major operations and was hospitalized dozens of times. And yet, she kept performing. Friends said she lived in a haze for years, insulated by assistants and medical staff who were afraid to intervene. Even as rumors swirled, Wynette projected strength. She appeared on TV, smiled in interviews, and sang about survival, all while battling an invisible war inside. Tammy Wynette died in 1998 at the age of 55. Officially, it was from a blood clot in her lungs. But many believe her decades of alcohol and drug use contributed to a quiet, cumulative decline. She had given everything to her art, including, perhaps, her life. Her music lives on. But so does the unspoken story of a woman who stood by the stage, even when her body begged her to stop. Allan Coe was never built for Nashville's clean-cut image. He was the original outlaw, a drifter, a rebel, and an unapologetic troublemaker. His lyrics were raw, his look was intimidating, and his lifestyle was soaked in rebellion and alcohol. Before the music, there was prison. Coe spent most of his youth in reform schools and penitentiaries, including a long stint in Ohio State Penitentiary. By the time he hit Nashville, he was already a hardened man, covered in tattoos and stories most people wouldn't believe. Music became his salvation, but the demons he brought with him never loosened their grip. In the 1970s, Coe broke through with songs like You Never Even Called Me By My Name and The Ride, establishing himself as a unique and powerful voice in the outlaw country scene. But his real life was often more chaotic than the lyrics he sang. He drank constantly, partied violently, and refused to follow anyone's rules, especially his own. Bandmates and road crew spoke of nights that turned dangerous. He would drink until he blacked out, wake up in a rage, and threaten anyone in arm's reach. Promoters dreaded working with him. He'd show up late, drunk, or not at all. And when he did perform, his sets were unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes barely coherent. He often claimed to be misunderstood, a genius stifled by the industry. But alcohol played a central role in his isolation. His antics, many of which were fueled by booze, led to professional blacklisting and a reputation that made even the outlaw crowd keep their distance. As Nashville evolved, Coe remained stuck in a hard-living world he refused to leave. Despite the chaos, he continued to release music and tour, often independently, away from the mainstream. His fan base remained fiercely loyal, drawn to his honesty and edge. But the cost of that edge was high. Failed marriages, legal troubles, and long-term health issues followed him like a shadow. Today, Allan Coe stands as one of country's most controversial figures and one of its most haunted. A legend, yes, but one who often seemed more comfortable in the darkness of a dive bar than under the lights of the Grand Ole Opry. Travis Tritt came onto the country music scene in the late 1980s like a southern storm, part outlaw, part rockstar, and all attitude, with hits like Here's a Quarter, Call Someone Who Cares, Anymore, and Trouble. He brought a new edge to Nashville, blending traditional country roots with bluesy grit. But as his fame skyrocketed, so did his appetite for self-destruction, and alcohol was never far from reach. In interviews, Tritt often projected confidence, even cockiness. But behind that swagger was a man struggling to manage the pressures of sudden stardom. The touring never stopped, the demands never eased, and the bottle became a constant companion. Those who toured with him said the drinking wasn't just celebratory, it was part of his rhythm. The pre-show whiskey, the mid-show buzz, the post-show blackout. While Tritt never spiraled as publicly or tragically as some of his predecessors, his drinking created cracks in his career. His temper flared more easily. He alienated collaborators, pushed away managers, and clashed with record executives. One notorious incident in the mid-1990s saw him storm out of a televised event after a backstage disagreement, reportedly fueled by drinking before going on air. It wasn't the first time, and wouldn't be the last. His personal relationships weren't immune either. Tritt went through 2 divorces before settling into his 3rd and current marriage. While he never publicly blamed alcohol for the breakdowns, those close to him have long speculated that his hard-living lifestyle made intimacy difficult. The rock and roll image came at a cost, emotionally and professionally. In more recent years, Tritt has spoken about maturing, finding peace, and being more intentional with his choices. He continues to tour and record, though not at the frantic pace of his earlier years. Whether or not he fully conquered the bottle is unclear, but his story remains a powerful reminder that even the loudest voices in country music can be muffled by personal struggle. Travis Tritt's legacy is still unfolding, But for a long stretch of time, he was more than just a man who sang about trouble. He was living inside it. Billy Joe Shaver was the poet outlaw of country music, a man whose lyrics could gut you with a single line, and whose life was as rugged as the songs he wrote. Behind every verse about heartache, salvation, and grit was a man who lived on the edge. And much of that edge was soaked in whiskey. Born in Texas in 1939, Shaver came up the hard way. He lost 2 fingers in a sawmill accident, hitchhiked to Nashville with little more than a dream, and eventually became the uncredited architect of the outlaw country sound. His 1973 album, Old Five and Dimers Like Me, produced by Chris Christopherson, remains a touchstone for honest, stripped-down country storytelling. But while his songs brimmed with emotional clarity, his personal life was a storm of chaos, violence, and alcohol. Shaver was never far from a drink. He'd show up to gigs reeking of bourbon, his speech already slurred, his guitar case soaked from spilled liquor. Friends described him as brilliant and broken, capable of writing a timeless classic in the afternoon, then brawling in a bar that same night. His drinking was more than a bad habit. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a defense against a world that had always seemed to take more than it gave. The tragedies in his life were almost Shakespearean. His wife died of cancer. His mother passed away soon after. Then in 2000, his only son and musical partner, Eddie, died of a heroin overdose. Billy Joe spiraled. The whiskey became an anchor he couldn't cut loose. He drank to numb the pain, but the pain only deepened. In 2007, Shaver was arrested for shooting a man in the face outside a bar in Waco, Texas. He claimed self-defense and was eventually acquitted. When asked by the judge why he didn't walk away, Shaver famously replied, "I wanted to see him beg for his life." It was vintage Billy Joe, part myth, part menace, and all raw emotion. He kept performing well into his 70s, his voice ragged, his eyes distant. When he died in 2020 from a massive stroke, the tributes poured in. He was called a legend, a genius, a foundational figure of outlaw country. But those who knew him best would say this: Billy Joe Shaver was a man who bled for his songs and drank to stop the bleeding. George Strait, known to fans as the King of Country, might seem like an unlikely name on a list of hard drinkers. With his clean-cut image, tightly pressed jeans, and polite Texas demeanor, he appeared to be the antithesis of the rowdy outlaw crowd. But behind the stage lights and polished performances, there were long stretches where alcohol quietly colored the edges of his life. Not with spectacle, but with solitude. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Strait never courted headlines for public meltdowns or bar brawls. His drinking was mostly private, often wrapped in grief and silence. The loss of his 13-year-old daughter in a tragic car accident in 1986 shook him to his core. He rarely spoke of it, avoiding interviews and press for years. Friends close to him say that was the turning point, the moment the whiskey stopped being celebratory and started being medicinal. During tours, Strait was known to drink heavily after shows, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few trusted crew members. It wasn't wild and it wasn't loud, but it was consistent. A way to wind down, to disappear, to keep feelings buried. Fellow musicians described him as always in control, except when he wasn't. On rare occasions, those moments of unraveling would show. Missed sound checks, unusually short sets, nights where he seemed emotionally vacant. Unlike many others on this list, Strait never let alcohol destroy his public persona or professional commitments. He remained one of the most reliable performers in the business. But behind that reliability was a man carrying a quiet, aching sorrow and a bottle close at hand. His music reflected that grief in subtle ways. Songs like Baby Blue and You'll Be There held more than just melody. They held memory. Loss. A search for peace he rarely discussed. Over time, Strait pulled back from touring, focused on family, and shifted his lifestyle toward privacy and control. He never made a dramatic announcement about sobriety. There was no rehab special, no book deal, just a slow, steady withdrawal from the noise, and perhaps from the bottle too. George Strait remains a symbol of professionalism in country music, but his inclusion here is a reminder that not all drinking is loud, and not all pain shows itself on stage. Hank Williams Jr. was born into legend, the son of the iconic Hank Sr., whose shadow loomed large over every step he took. While his father died from alcohol-related complications at just 29, Hank Jr. seemed determined to walk a similar path, blazing through fame, rebellion, and decades of hard drinking that nearly killed him more than once. From a young age, Hank Jr. was pushed into the spotlight. As a teenager, he performed his father's songs on stage, mimicking the style and voice of a man he never truly knew. The pressure to live up to the myth was suffocating. By his 20s, he began carving out his own identity, louder, rowdier, more defiant, and always with a drink in hand. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Hank Jr. became the face of Southern rock-infused country. His songs, like Whiskey Bent and Hellbound and All My Rowdy Friends Have Settled Down, were autobiographical testaments to a life lived hard. And the stories behind the music were even wilder. He'd drink for days, vanish into backwoods cabins with cases of Jack Daniels, then return to the studio with a masterpiece, or sometimes not at all. The most dramatic chapter came in 1975, when he nearly died in a mountain climbing accident in Montana. He fell over 500 feet, suffering skull fractures and facial injuries so severe that doctors weren't sure he'd survive. The recovery was brutal. Dozens of surgeries, years of physical pain. And alcohol was there every step of the way, numbing the agony, feeding the rage. Those who toured with him described a man who could outdrink entire bands. He'd take the stage glassy-eyed, then rip through a 2-hour set like a freight train. Other nights, he wouldn't make it to the stage at all. The unpredictability became part of his mystique, the wild son of a fallen legend, determined to outrun his father's ghost while drowning in the same poison. In later years, Hank Jr. tempered the chaos, but never completely abandoned the bottle. His interviews remained fiery, his opinions unfiltered, and his music laced with whiskey-soaked wisdom. He survived what killed his father, barely, and lived to tell about it. Hank Williams Jr. didn't just inherit a name. He inherited the demons too, and for most of his life, he met them glass for glass. Gary Stewart was country music's great tragic flame, brilliant, explosive, and gone far too soon. Known for his piercing vibrato and honky-tonk anthems, Stewart carved a space for himself in the 1970s as one of the most original voices in the genre. But behind that voice was a man haunted by depression, loss, and a crippling dependence on alcohol that ultimately consumed him. Born in Florida, Stewart grew up playing guitar and piano in church before falling headfirst into the baroom world of Southern honky-tonk. His breakout album Out of Hand in 1975 was a revelation, blending raw, emotional vocals with sharp lyrics about cheating, drinking, and desperation. Songs like She's Actin' Single, I'm Drinkin' Doubles weren't just catchy, they were confessions. He wasn't playing a character, he was writing his life. Gary Stewart drank like he sang. Hard, fast, and without apology. On tour, he'd polish off a bottle before stepping on stage, then lose himself in the music. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes dangerously. Bandmates recalled shows where he'd forget lyrics, lash out at sound crews, or simply walk off mid-set. When he was sober, he was deeply introspective and gentle. When he was drunk, he was unpredictable and volatile. As his fame faded in the 1980s, so did his grip on reality. Stewart withdrew from the spotlight, rarely gave interviews, and began a long, slow descent into isolation. He kept recording, but his albums were erratic, flashes of brilliance surrounded by long silences. He drank more, trusted less. Friends said he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that he was being overlooked, erased by an industry he helped shape. In 2003, after the death of his wife Mary Lou, his lifelong companion and anchor, Stewart unraveled completely. Just 1 month later, he was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 58. Many believe it wasn't just grief that took him. It was years of drinking that had eroded his mental health, distorted his world, and silenced his voice. To this day, Gary Stewart remains a cult figure in country music, a man whose talent was as towering as his tragedy. He didn't die young, but he died broken. And for those who knew him, the saddest part wasn't how he went out, but how long he'd been fading before anyone noticed. Tanya Tucker was a country music sensation before she was even old enough to drive. With her breakout hit Delta Dawn at just 13 years old, she became the teenage darling of Nashville, bold, precocious, and powerful beyond her years. But growing up in the spotlight came with a heavy price, and by the time she hit adulthood, Tanya wasn't just singing about heartbreak and rebellion. She was living it, often through the bottom of a bottle. The pressures of fame, the constant touring, and the lack of a stable childhood all took their toll. In her 20s, Tanya's life spiraled into a blur of parties, toxic relationships, and relentless drinking. She quickly shed her child prodigy image and embraced a wilder persona, a whiskey-drinking, sharp-tongued firebrand who was as famous for her offstage behavior as for her music. Her stormy, highly publicized relationship with fellow country star Glenn Campbell in the early 1980s was fueled by passion, tabloids, and alcohol. Their fights were legendary, their chemistry undeniable, but their shared addiction made the love story burn fast and crash hard. The tabloids couldn't get enough, but behind the headlines was a woman unraveling under the glare of public scrutiny and the numbing comfort of liquor. As the 1980s progressed, Tanya's career began to stall. While she continued to release music, her personal battles overshadowed her artistry. There were missed shows, erratic interviews, and rumors of breakdowns. She later admitted to self-medicating with alcohol and drugs to deal with depression and anxiety, much of it stemming from a childhood spent performing instead of living. But unlike many of her peers, Tanya Tucker didn't disappear. In the late 90s and early 2000s, she began to take control of her life. She sought help, pulled back from the party scene, and slowly rebuilt her career. Her 2019 comeback album, While I'm Livin', produced by Brandi Carlile, won a Grammy and reminded the world of the raw power and emotional depth that made her a star in the first place. Tanya never pretended to be perfect. She was open about her struggles, her scars, and the long road back from addiction. In doing so, she became more than just a survivor. She became a symbol of grit, resilience, and honesty, the kind of country legend who doesn't just sing the truth, but lives it, stumbles through it, and comes out swinging on the other side. Johnny Cash was more than a country music legend. He was a myth, a force of nature dressed in black, haunted by sin, salvation, and a lifelong battle with addiction. While he's often remembered today for his poetic wisdom and redemptive arc, the truth is far grittier. For much of his career, Johnny Cash was a man barely holding himself together, and alcohol was one of his oldest vices. Cash's descent began early in his rise to fame. After his breakout success with Sun Records and the release of I Walk the Line, the pressures of touring, fame, and internal turmoil pushed him towards self-medication. Though pills, particularly amphetamines and barbiturates, would become his most notorious vice, alcohol was always close by, the steady companion between binges, the fallback when drugs weren't available. Friends and family recalled long stretches where Cash would vanish into a fog of drinking, not returning calls or emerging from hotel rooms for days. He'd show up on stage glassy-eyed and reeking of whiskey. Some nights, he delivered transcendent performances. Other nights, he mumbled lyrics, missed verses, or staggered off mid-set. Audiences never knew which Johnny they were going to get, the prophet or the wreck. His marriage to Vivian Liberto dissolved under the weight of addiction and infidelity. He once nearly burned down a forest in California while drunk and high, setting off a wildfire that killed dozens of endangered condors. The government fined him heavily. His response, "I don't care about your damn yellow buzzards." And yet, even at his lowest, his talent never left him. It haunted him as much as his demons did. In 1968, he married June Carter, a woman who would become his anchor, his mirror, and ultimately his salvation. With her help, he sobered up, not permanently, but long enough to rediscover his voice and reinvent himself. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the cycle continued. Periods of sobriety, interrupted by relapses, followed by soul-bearing returns to the studio. He sang about Jesus and the devil in equal measure. And when he teamed up with Rick Rubin in the 1990s for the American Recording Series, his voice, older, weathered, etched with pain, gave new life to old wounds. Johnny Cash never beat his addictions, but he turned them into art, and in doing so, he gave generations a soundtrack to their own darkness, and maybe a way through it. Jessie Coulter was more than just the wife of Waylon Jennings. She was a formidable singer-songwriter in her own right, a trailblazer in the outlaw country movement, and one of the few women to stand tall among a crowd of hard-living men. Her voice was soulful, smoky, laced with melancholy, and her presence was both commanding and compassionate. But being married to one of country music's most notorious drinkers meant that Jesse's life was never far from chaos, and often from the bottle itself. Coulter rose to fame in the 1970s with hits like I'm Not Lisa, a poignant ballad that captured the aching heart of a woman caught in someone else's memories. While her music was more introspective than rebellious, her life was anything but quiet. Her marriage to Waylon Jennings was a whirlwind of love, loyalty, and shared struggle, especially when it came to addiction. Living with Waylon during the height of his substance abuse meant being surrounded by alcohol, drugs, and a lifestyle that took no prisoners. Coulter once described their early years together as life on the run, never staying in one place, always trying to outrun the consequences. She drank, too, sometimes to keep up, sometimes to cope. There were stretches where both were barely functioning, their days fueled by whiskey and pills, their nights lost in blurred arguments and missed opportunities. Yet Coulter never lost herself completely. Unlike many of her peers, she retained a quiet spiritual strength, often turning to prayer and songwriting as a way to process the dysfunction around her. Her Christian faith became both shield and compass, helping her weather Waylon's darkest periods and her own brushes with dependency. She played a critical role in helping Jennings sober up in the 1980s. It wasn't through ultimatums or threats, but through endurance, staying beside him when others walked away, offering patience when he offered none. Her own decision to step back from music for a time was, in part, a survival move, to focus on family, health, and healing. In later years, Coulter returned to music, releasing deeply personal albums that reflected on love, loss, and the price of a life lived in the fire. Her 2006 record, Out of the Ashes, was aptly named, a quiet triumph after decades of emotional wreckage. Jessie Coulter's story isn't one of public collapse or scandal. It's quieter, more internal, a slow endurance in the face of consuming darkness. And while her name may not be shouted as loudly as the men around her, her survival speaks volumes. Steve Earle has long been one of country music's most uncompromising voices, a poet, a fighter, and a man who never flinched from the messiness of life. His songs cut deep, wrestling with war, addiction, injustice, and love in all its broken forms. But for decades, Earle's most personal battle was with himself, and alcohol was one of the weapons he turned inward. Emerging in the mid-1980s with critically acclaimed albums like Guitar Town and Copperhead Road, Earle quickly developed a reputation as a songwriter, brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly unafraid. But his rebellious streak wasn't just in the music. Offstage, he lived hard. Booze was constant. Cocaine and heroin soon followed. But the alcohol came first, and never really left. Earle didn't drink to party. He drank to feel something, or nothing, to fight the anxiety, to numb the pressure. He described his early years in Nashville as a blur of bars, bad decisions, and bourbon. Studio producers never knew what version of Steve would show up, the genius or the ghost. His shows were just as erratic. Some nights, he was electric. Other nights, he was too drunk to remember his own lyrics. By the early 1990s, Earle had lost nearly everything. Record labels dropped him. Concerts dried up. Friends stopped calling. His addiction, fed in equal measure by alcohol and heroin, landed him in jail in 1994. It was the wake-up call no one else had been able to give him. In prison, he got clean. And when he got out, he began one of the most remarkable comebacks in modern country music. His 1995 album, Train-A-Comin', was raw, acoustic, and reflective. The sound of a man clawing his way back. From there, Earle built a new chapter, marked by sobriety, activism, and brutally honest songwriting. He spoke openly about addiction, including how alcohol had been the first crack in the foundation. He never glamorized it. He never denied it. He used it as a warning and as a lens. Earle remains sober to this day, decades after his fall. His voice is more gravely, his face weathered, but his art is sharper than ever. And unlike many of the legends he admired, Steve Earle didn't let the bottle write his final verse. He wrestled it to the ground, and then wrote songs about what it nearly stole from him. Linda Ronstadt may not be the first name that comes to mind when you think of country music's hard drinkers, but her impact on the genre and her complex relationship with fame, pressure, and alcohol earn her a place in this story. She was a crossover queen, a vocal powerhouse who moved seamlessly between country, rock, and pop. But behind the soaring harmonies and Grammy wins was a woman who, at times, turned to alcohol as a crutch in a world that demanded too much and offered too little comfort. Born in Arizona and raised in a musical family, Ronstadt exploded onto the scene in the late 1960s and 1970s. Her early albums blended country soul with California rock, and hits like Blue Bayou and When Will I Be Loved captured the hearts of millions. She collaborated with country giants, including Emmylou Harris and Dolly Parton. And her contribution to the genre's evolution was undeniable. But fame came with a cost. In interviews, Ronstadt was candid about the psychological toll of constant touring, public scrutiny, and the pressure to always be perfect. Alcohol wasn't a daily indulgence. It was a release valve. She drank when the loneliness became too heavy. She drank when the spotlight burned too bright. And she drank when the music no longer drowned out the noise in her head. Those close to her recalled periods in the 1980s where Ronstadt became increasingly withdrawn. While never known for erratic public behavior, she privately struggled with anxiety and the demands of an industry that often dismissed women once they aged out of their prime. Alcohol became at times a companion, a quiet one, a dangerous one. But Ronstadt's story is also one of awareness. She recognized her patterns. She pulled back. She shifted her focus to musical projects that fed her soul rather than drained it, from mariachi albums to collaborations rooted in heritage and heart. She never allowed the bottle to define her, but she never denied its shadow either. In 2013, Ronstadt revealed she had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which later progressed to a form of progressive supranuclear palsy that robbed her of her singing voice. And yet, her legacy, in country and beyond, remains intact. A legend who danced with the same demons as many of her male counterparts, but who managed to step away before they took her voice, her art, or her life. Townes Van Zandt may be the purest example of the tortured genius in country music's long and painful history. A master songwriter, revered by legends like Willie Nelson's Steve Earle and Emmylou Harris, Townes crafted songs that felt like whispered prayers from the edge of the world. But while his lyrics were elegant, precise, and heartbreakingly human, his personal life was a slow-motion collapse, and alcohol was the steady hand that guided it downward. Born into wealth and privilege in Texas, Van Zandt was never meant to live the kind of life he chose. His family envisioned law school, politics, or business. But after undergoing insulin shock therapy in a psychiatric hospital as a teenager, a treatment that reportedly erased large chunks of his long-term memory, Townes drifted toward music, and almost immediately, toward the bottle. He drank not like a man who enjoyed drinking, but like a man trying to disappear. Whiskey was his chosen poison, and it followed him through every dive bar, hotel room, and roadside gig. His performances were famously unpredictable. One night, he'd stun the room into silence with a haunting rendition of Waiting Around to Die. The next, he'd be too drunk to hold a guitar upright. Fellow musicians loved him and feared for him. Guy Clarks, Steve Earle, and others tried again and again to pull him back from the edge, but Townes never showed much interest in saving himself. He lived in trailers, couch surfed, missed shows, and gave away publishing rights to his greatest songs for the price of a bottle. Some of his best work, including the devastating Pancho and Lefty, brought others commercial success while he slipped further into obscurity. His relationships crumbled. His body weakened. And still he drank. Friends described him as the funniest, saddest, most brilliant man they'd ever met, and the most self-destructive. When Steve Earle famously said he'd stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table and declare Townes the greatest songwriter who ever lived, it wasn't just admiration. It was heartbreak. Townes Van Zandt died on January 1st, 1997, at the age of 52, from heart failure following years of substance abuse. He died exactly 44 years after Hank Williams Sr., one of his greatest idols. Some saw that as a poetic coincidence. Others saw it as destiny fulfilled. Van Zandt never chased stardom. He chased ghosts. And for all the brilliance he left behind, There's an H in every note, the ache of a man who wrote what he couldn't survive. Dwight Yoakam stood apart from his contemporaries, sharp-dressed, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically unique. He revived the Bakersfield sound when country music was leaning pop, and he brought a cool rockabilly swagger to Nashville when everyone else was playing it safe. But beneath the polished exterior and signature skinny jeans was a man who, for years, masked exhaustion, loneliness, and internal chaos with a quiet but steady dependence on alcohol. Yoakam didn't drink loudly. He didn't crash cars, get arrested, or make headlines for public meltdowns. His relationship with alcohol was more discreet, more private, but no less damaging. As his fame rose in the late 1980s with hits like Guitars, Cadillacs, and Ain't That Lonely Yet, so did the pressures of carrying a movement on his back. He wasn't just fighting for his own voice. He was challenging the entire Nashville establishment. The weight of expectation, the grueling tour schedules, and a deep-seated perfectionism took their toll. Yoakam began drinking more often, sometimes to wind down after shows, sometimes just to feel less alone. Friends and bandmates noticed the pattern: the slow pour backstage, the long silences on the bus, the bottles that piled up quietly in hotel rooms. He wasn't out of control, but he wasn't in control either. He once confessed in an interview that the persona he projected, the confident, brooding outsider, wasn't always real. Sometimes the boots in the hat are just armor, he said. The drinking, many believe, became another layer of that armor, a way to preserve the illusion while the man underneath struggled to keep pace with his own myth. Despite the drinking, Yoakam remained prolific. He released critically acclaimed albums, acted in major films, and maintained a fiercely loyal fan base. But as the years went on, he began to pull back, from the spotlight, from touring, and, reportedly, from the bottle. While he never made a public statement about sobriety, those close to him say he quietly stepped away from alcohol in the late 2000s, choosing instead to focus on health, creative control, and legacy. The edge in his music never dulled, but the chaos behind it slowly quieted. Dwight Yoakam didn't let drinking define him, but for a long stretch, it haunted the silence between songs. And like so many legends before him, he learned that survival in country music often depends not just on what you sing, but on what you put down when the lights go out.